brothers and sisters, hear me. They tried to chain my words with paper, pages drafted by strangers bearing no signatures, a manual for surrender, an apology packaged as statecraft. They said to me, "Read it, Mr. President, don't push back. This is how alliances endure. This is how you stay safe." But I was not sent to the World Assembly to echo their lines. My people did not elect me to sit quiet. I will not beg forgiveness for naming what is happening in Gaza, for calling out foreign meddling, or for exposing the quiet strangling of our continent. I stand here for voices hushed for centuries. No memorandum, no outside power, no threat of exclusion will erase that duty. I folded their prepared script and took to the podium with my own words. It started with the speech 2 months earlier that they said crossed the line. I spoke plainly about actions in Gaza. I compared the cries of Palestinian mothers to those of mothers in Mali, Congo, Niger. I warned that if Africa stayed silent, we would be complicit. That did not sit well with the self-appointed guardians of order. A week later, a letter came from the Secretary General's office. My remarks had created diplomatic strain and endangered regional cooperation. They ordered me to appear, not to debate, but to recant. They wanted confession, not explanation. Then the calls began. Paris, Washington, Tel Aviv, quiet lines buzzing with offers and thinly veiled threats. "We can reconsider aid if you step back," they said. "Surely you prefer to avoid sanctions." Finally, they drafted a speech for me. Several pages apologizing for tone, a few for wording, others to reaffirm supposed shared values. Whose values? Ours do not include silence in the face of mass suffering. I could have stayed home. I could have chosen the safer path. But absence would have handed them the narrative. If I did not go, they would claim victory. So I boarded the plane to New York carrying no borrowed text, no contrition, and no intention of bowing. The week leading to the assembly revealed the depth of their panic. 3 days after the drafted apology landed on my desk, my personal phone rang at 2 in the morning. An unfamiliar voice claimed to be from the State Department. 20 minutes later, an unmarked black SUV pulled up to the palace. No flags, no plates, no ceremony. An envoy entered my office with 2 quiet men and opened a case, spreading documents across my desk, satellite images of our mines, financial sheets from recent Chinese agreements, intelligence about foreign military advisors we had not publicly announced. "We know everything," he said softly. "We can frame it as cooperation rather than what it might actually be." I leaned back. "And what do you think it really is, Ambassador?" He offered a warning. What we were doing could make their governments uneasy. For months we had been quietly rebalancing partnerships. Chinese technicians rewired parts of our communications. Russian agronomists taught new farming methods. Iranian pharmaceutical firms built factories to make medicines here, not out of hatred for the West, but out of a recognition that dependency is another form of bondage, dressed in better language. He suggested my UN remarks need not be confrontational. "You can make your point while preserving ties," he said. I asked him, "When your country invaded others, did you consult the world first? When France intervened in our region, did it ask for our leave? When schools are bombed, do they hand over apology drafts?" He closed his case and left with a cool smile. Be pragmatic. After he left, I asked my security chief, "How many Western operatives are under surveillance in Ouagadougou?" 17 confirmed, sir, he answered. "Likely double that undetected. And phone monitoring?" "All lines." "Good," I said. "Feed them a story that I'm having second thoughts. Let them think the pressure is working. Because here is what they never grasped. I planned not only to reject their script, but to reveal why they had written it." The next morning, Western embassies across Africa began circulating hints that their campaign had succeeded. Headlines claimed the leader of Burkina might soften. Anonymous diplomatic sources murmured compromise. Washington exhaled. They thought they had won. Meanwhile, I stood in Revolution Square before 50,000 people and told them what I intended to say in that hall. They expect an apology, I told the crowd. They believe Africa still asks permission to speak. The roar that followed confirmed what I had known. When a crowd hears truth, no cable or memo can silence it. Old women wept. Young men chanted. Children who did not fully grasp the politics still felt the current of pride. They can freeze our aid. They can threaten sanctions. They can draft speeches for us. But they cannot bend our spines, calls came from friends. A Rwandan leader phoned. "Are you ready?" he asked. "We have prepared our whole lives," I answered. "This is not the hour for fear." At JFK, Africans living in the city greeted my motorcade with signs, "We will not apologize," and "He speaks for us." A university student ran alongside the car shouting, "Show them we are not small. Make them hear us." In that moment, it was clear this speech was no longer mine alone. Inside the assembly, delegates watched a man they had labeled reckless. Some smirked. Others averted their eyes. I took the microphone and asked straight away, "Before you demand an apology from me, tell me, how many apologies have you offered to Africa? Has Belgium owned its crimes in the Congo? Has France made amends for Algeria? Has anyone apologized for supporting armed groups that shattered our stability?" Cameras tightened. Murmurs fizzed. I continued, each pause measured. "You call it defense when bombs fall on Gaza. You call it economics when our children go hungry because trade rules produce poverty. When we assert ourselves, you call it dangerous." Every sentence was deliberate. I reminded them Africa would not accept being lectured by those who export war while preaching peace, who promote coups while teaching democracy, who offer aid that becomes debt. A French delegate rose and walked out. Let him go, I thought. This was not a performance-seeking applause. It was a bearing of truth. Then I pulled out my phone and read a message from a child back home. "Sir, my teacher says you will go to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small." That child's dignity, I said, outshone the accusers. I apologized, but only for one thing, that it had taken so long for an African leader to stand and speak plainly in that hall. I would not apologize for refusing occupation disguised as diplomacy. I would not apologize for defending our dignity. I would not apologize for being proudly African. If that discomforted them, perhaps they were finally beginning to feel what we have for centuries. The fallout was immediate. The African Union convened an emergency session. Ambassadors drafted a declaration rejecting conditional aid, refusing to apologize for defending sovereignty, and blocking foreign dictates on domestic policy. Within 48 hours, a dozen presidents signed. In the streets, the change surged. Students organized campus lessons on self-determination. Market women in several cities refused to deal with firms tied to occupation. Artists sampled my words into new songs. Governments froze funds and threatened reviews. Media launched smear campaigns. Think tanks warned of isolation. But while capitals debated punishment, people acted. In Nairobi, students held a dignity day. In Kingston, a radio station aired the speech in full, calling it a long overdue wake-up call. In Harlem, a mural appeared, a silhouette of an African leader with the words "No apology given." Caribbean nations announced moves away from conditional programs. Leaders called to say that my words had given their people permission to remember themselves. Back home, volunteers did not protest. They built. They repaired schools, reopened irrigation channels, and launched technology labs funded by diaspora donations. A grandmother on television said simply, "I may not read much, but today I am proud." They measure strength in currency. We measure it in self-respect. When neighboring capitals saw a poor nation speak the law of nations with clarity, and then feed its people without foreign strings, their assumption of our incapacity began to fall away. Indeed. When I returned from New York, some expected me to come back defeated. They thought I would land quietly, embarrassed, cautious, maybe even afraid. But the reality was different. At the airport, the people filled the road like a river of humanity. They held flags, drums, and their own homemade banners. Children sat on shoulders, shouting my name, not as a man, but as a symbol of their own voice being heard. And when I stepped out, I raised my hand, not in triumph, but in promise. I told them, "The struggle is not over. The world has only begun to hear us." In the palace that evening, my closest advisors looked at me with mixed expressions. Some were proud, others anxious. One of them asked, "Sir, do you know what you've done? They may freeze our accounts, cut our aid, blacklist our companies." I leaned forward and said, "Good. Then finally we will be forced to stand on our own feet. For too long they have used aid as a leash. If they cut it, the leash is broken." Silence filled the room. They realized I was serious. The following weeks were turbulent. Western media outlets painted me as a radical, a reckless populist, a danger to global order. They called me naive. They called me arrogant. Some even whispered that I was a puppet of foreign powers. But the more they shouted, the more ordinary Africans listened. Because people know truth when they hear it, even if the messenger is mocked. Our young people began organizing themselves. In universities, debates about independence, sovereignty, and dignity returned with new life. In villages, elders told stories of ancestors who resisted colonial powers, comparing them to the current moment. Musicians recorded songs, street artists painted murals, and preachers reminded their congregations that freedom was not given, it was taken. It was as if an old fire long buried under ashes had been reignited. Of course, retaliation was swift. Within 2 months, one major Western bank announced it would no longer process our transactions. Another country halted wheat shipments. The IMF released a report warning of economic instability and risks of isolation. They thought fear of hunger and scarcity would bend us. But we had prepared. Farmers organized cooperatives. Local bakers experimented with alternative grains, and communities shared resources instead of waiting for imports. What was meant to break us ended up strengthening our solidarity. Then came the turning point. A neighboring president, long seen as a Western ally, invited me for a private meeting. I expected confrontation. Instead, he whispered, "Brother, you have done what we all dream of but fear. You spoke without chains. You stood without begging. Do not think you are alone." That moment showed me, though many leaders wear suits of diplomacy, inside they carry the same anger, the same humiliation. They simply lacked the courage to say it aloud. Now that one had spoken, others could follow. News began to spread of countries reconsidering military agreements that had given foreign powers unchecked influence. Some governments started renegotiating mining contracts, demanding higher shares for local communities. Others quietly reached out to alternative partners, no longer content to depend on those who treated them as children. But the struggle was not only external. Inside my own nation, some elites who benefited from the old order resisted fiercely. They feared losing privileges, losing easy money from foreign development projects that never developed us. A few even attempted to stir unrest, sponsoring protests against my government, accusing me of isolating the country. But when people saw who was paying for those protests, their anger turned on the instigators. "We know who you serve," the crowd shouted. "You serve their money, not our dignity." One evening, my intelligence chief entered my office carrying a sealed folder. He looked pale. Inside were intercepted communications suggesting certain foreign agencies were discussing ways to remove me from power, by destabilization or worse. He asked if I wanted extra security. I told him history shows us, if they cannot buy you, they try to break you. But remember this, a leader may fall, but an idea cannot be assassinated. I knew danger was real, but I also knew fear was their greatest weapon. If I showed it, the message would collapse. So I continued speaking. Not just in government halls, but in marketplaces, universities, mosques, and churches. I told the people plainly, they want to frighten us into silence. But our silence is the grave of our children's future. We must endure today's hardship so that tomorrow they do not kneel as we did. As months passed, something extraordinary began to happen. Other regions outside Africa began echoing the same defiance. In the Caribbean, leaders started questioning IMF programs. In Latin America, new movements invoked Africa's stand as proof that dependency could be broken. In the Middle East, activists shared my speech with subtitles, drawing parallels to their struggles. It was as if one stone thrown in New York had sent ripples across the oceans. 1 year after the infamous UN confrontation, the world looked different. Our GDP had not doubled, our infrastructure was still modest, and yes, our trade had suffered. But the spirit of the people was transformed. Where once you saw hopelessness, now you saw determination. Where once corruption seemed untouchable, now citizens demanded accountability. Where once foreign dictates were swallowed, now they were questioned. They thought cutting aid would starve us. Instead, it forced us to discover the wealth of our soil and the power of our people. They thought isolating us would shame us. Instead, it connected us with brothers and sisters worldwide who also refused to kneel. I often return to the words of that child whose message I read at the UN. Please don't let them make you small. That, more than any statistic, defined our journey. We refused to be made small. And in doing so, we discovered just how large we could be. So I say now to every African, to every oppressed person across the globe, our time of silence is over. We will not apologize for existing. We will not apologize for resisting. We will not apologize for demanding dignity. We may stumble, we may bleed, we may be punished, but the path has been chosen. And one day, when history remembers these years, it will not remember the threats or the sanctions. It will remember that finally, after centuries, we stood tall and said, "We are free, and we are unafraid."